the credibility gap entered American political vocabulary. David Halberstam of the New York Times, Neil Sheehan of the United Press International, they challenged official optimism, and they were attacked as unpatriotic, defeatist, biased. They were also correct. Robert McNamara, the architect of escalation, privately concluded by 1967 that the war could not be won. Before leaving office, he commissioned a secret history. The Pentagon Papers documented 4 administrations' worth of deception. The war had been based on flawed assumptions. The public had been systematically misled. General Westmoreland had assured the public just weeks before that the enemy was weakening, that the war had entered a phase when the end begins to come into view. Tet made those assurances look like lies, or at least delusion. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted newsman in America, traveled to Vietnam. He concluded his broadcast with an unprecedented editorial. It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience in Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
On April 30th, 1975, the last Americans evacuated Saigon by helicopter from the embassy roof as North Vietnamese tanks entered the city. The iconic photographs, desperate civilians clinging to helicopter skids, the frantic evacuation of a burning embassy, the ambassador clutching the folded flag, marked the end of one of America's longest wars and its most devastating defeats. The war had lasted, depending on how you count, between 10 and 30 years. It cost 58,220 American lives, lives whose names are now inscribed on a black granite wall in Washington. It killed between 2 and 3 million Vietnamese. It tore American society apart. It ended a presidency. It shattered the Cold War consensus that shaped American foreign policy since 1947. And it failed to achieve its central objective: a stable, independent South Vietnam capable of surviving without American military support did not occur. South Vietnam fell. The dominoes did not fall. Vietnam became a communist country and eventually an American trading partner, host to American factories and destination for American tourists. The grand struggle that consumed a generation proved, in strategic terms, meaningless, as it failed to produce any lasting strategic gains. The war was unnecessary to U.S. security interest. The intelligence community assessed repeatedly that Vietnam was not vital to American security. And any winning objectives were unattainable by the strategies employed. This is a reality the commanders in the field understood, but the leaders in Washington refused to accept. And it was conducted through systematic deception, lies told to Congress, to the press, and to the American people about progress that was not occurring, and light at a tunnel's end that did not exist. As an aside, as a person born in the late 70s, this is the first episode of this series that I can speak to with actual personal perspective. The war and its immediate aftermath defined and shaped a fair amount of my childhood and youth experiences. In cinema, from Platoon to Full Metal Jacket to Forrest Gump, Vietnam did not lack for reinterpretation to music, fashion, and pop culture writ large. Vietnam ended in the 70s, but it dominated American discourse and self-reflection throughout the 1980s and even in varying degrees the 1990s. One of my very closest friends for almost my entire life came to America as a young child, literally escaping the hell of that war. Vietnam is the template against which all American interventions must be measured. The pattern established here, initial optimism, escalation without clear objective, lies to sustain public support, eventual failure, and determined forgetting, would repeat in Iraq and Afghanistan. And many even wonder about what is happening today in Iran. The lessons of Vietnam would be invoked to justify subsequent wars, while the actual lessons would be ignored. Understanding why we fought, why we lost, and why we learned nothing is essential to understanding the wars that followed. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is episode 11 of the series, Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars. Today, Graveyard of Empires, Vietnam and the Limits of Power. This episode concludes part 4 of our series, the CIA and Covert Empire, by examining the war that emerged from covert beginnings to become America's greatest military catastrophe. Where previous episodes examined the template of regime change, this episode examines what happens when covert action gives way to open war, and that war that cannot be won. This episode also corresponds to Article 11 of our written series, and given the scope of the Vietnam War, I want to address some additional items that we could not quite cover in the written article. Let us begin with the origins that most Americans have forgotten.
I warned against entangling alliances. They did not listen. Now you can trace exactly how it happened.
The Consequential Actions podcast is on YouTube. Subscribe and follow each series from the very beginning.
Principled debate requires participation. Like the episodes. Leave a comment. Join the discussion.
Every series is organized as a playlist, from General Welfare to The New Leviathan to Empire of Liberty. Begin at the beginning.
Vietnam was a French colony, part of French Indochina along with Laos and Cambodia. French rule established in the mid-19th century had been extractive and brutal. The French extracted rice, rubber, and other resources. They imposed taxes that drove peasants into debt. They monopolized salt, alcohol, and opium production. And education was limited to the French-speaking elite. Traditional Vietnamese society was subordinated to colonial extraction. Resistance was constant. Ho Chi Minh spent decades organizing opposition to French rule. He traveled the world, working in London, Paris, New York, and Moscow. He was a communist, trained in Moscow, but he was first and foremost a Vietnamese nationalist. His communism was a means to the end of national liberation. During World War II, Japan occupied Indochina. Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh forces fought the Japanese occupation with assistance from American OSS officers. American officers parachuted into the jungle. They worked alongside Ho's guerrillas. They developed respect for Vietnamese effectiveness and commitment. Ho Chi Minh received American weapons and American training. And when Japan surrendered in August 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnamese independence. His declaration quoted the American Declaration of Independence. Specifically, all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The choice of text was deliberate. Ho admired American ideals. He hoped America would support Vietnamese independence against French colonialism. He wrote multiple letters to President Truman requesting assistance. These appeals were ignored. The Cold War was beginning. France was an ally whose support was needed for European reconstruction. Vietnamese independence? That was subordinated to European alliance. France sought to reimpose colonial control. The First Indochina War began in 1946. Ho offered negotiations. France demanded submission. The Viet Minh retreated to the countryside and began the guerrilla warfare that would characterize Vietnamese resistance for 3 decades. The United States, viewing the world through Cold War lenses, began supporting France. By 1954, America was paying 80% of the French war costs. The French war ended in catastrophe. At Dien Bien Phu, a remote valley in northwestern Vietnam, French forces were surrounded and besieged by Viet Minh troops under General Val Nguyen Giap. The fortress fell on May 7th, 1954, and France's will to continue was broken. The Geneva Accords of 1954 established a settlement. Vietnam would be divided at the 17th parallel, and nationwide reunification elections would be held in 1956. But the Eisenhower administration refused to sign the Geneva Accords. American officials understood that Ho Chi Minh would win any fair election. Eisenhower himself later acknowledged he estimated Ho would have received maybe 80% of the vote. So the elections were never held. The American commitment began with preventing democracy. For if the Vietnamese people would elect the wrong leader, well then they must not be permitted to choose. Ngo Dinh Diem became the U.S.-backed leader of South Vietnam. He was a Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist country, authoritarian, corrupt, nepotistic. His brother ran the secret police. His sister-in-law made inflammatory public statements. But he had American advisors, American money, and American weapons that sustained the regime. The Strategic Hamlet program forcibly relocated peasants into fortified villages, supposedly for their protection. But in practice, it alienated the rural population and strengthened the insurgency. By 1963, Diem had become a liability. The Buddhist crisis revealed the regime's brutality. Monks set themselves on fire in protest. Diem's sister-in-law dismissed the self-immolations as barbecues. And the Kennedy administration signaled that it would not oppose a coup. On November 1st, 1963, South Vietnamese generals overthrew Diem. He and his brother were murdered the following day, shot in the back of an armored personnel carrier. 3 weeks later, when Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, the war became fully America's responsibility. President Lyndon Johnson inherited both the commitment and the dilemma. He had no desire to fight a land war in Asia, but he believed he could not abandon South Vietnam without destroying his presidency. The solution was escalation by deception. On August 2nd, 1964, The USS Maddox, conducting electronic surveillance in the Gulf of Tonkin, was engaged by North Vietnamese patrol boats. The Maddox returned fire and was undamaged. This incident actually occurred. But on August 4th, the Maddox and another destroyer reported a second attack. Officers claimed to detect torpedo boats in the darkness. Both ships fired for hours at radar contacts. The second attack almost certainly did not occur. The radar contacts were probably false readings caused by weather conditions. No physical evidence of enemy action was found. Captain John Herrick of the Maddox cabled within hours. Review of action makes many reported contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful. Suggests complete evaluation before any further action. Johnson ignored the doubts. He went on television to announce retaliatory airstrikes. He requested authorization from Congress. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed the House unanimously, 416 to 0. The Senate passed it 88 to 2. Only Senators Wayne Morris of Oregon and Ernest Gruening of Alaska voted no. Morse called it a predated declaration of war. Gruening warned that all Vietnam is not worth the life of a single American boy. The resolution authorized the president to take all necessary measures. It was a blank check. Authorization for whatever war the president chose to fight, without constitutional requirement of a declaration. On that blank check, Johnson would deploy over 500,000 troops. The escalation of war was justified by an incident that internal communication immediately cast into doubt. In other words, the war began with a lie, and it would continue with lies. Before proceeding, it's important to consider the strongest case made by contemporaries in favor of intervention. Supporters argued Vietnam was not primarily about Vietnam itself, but about global credibility. If the United States failed to defend South Vietnam, then allies across Europe and Asia might question the reliability of American commitments. That would potentially destabilize the Cold War order. Within this framework, even a peripheral conflict could carry outsized strategic significance. And this argument was taken seriously by policymakers at the time. However, it depended on a critical assumption that credibility required sustaining military commitments, regardless of local conditions or overall strategic value. The experience in Vietnam would ultimately test and call into question that assumption. Now, from a libertarian perspective, the credibility argument rests on a flawed premise. That credibility is strengthened by engaging in conflicts regardless of their direct relevance to national defense. Where in practice, the opposite is true. Committing to peripheral or ambiguous conflicts can dilute strategic focus, expend resources, and entangle the state in situations where objectives are unclear or unattainable. Rather than reinforcing credibility, Vietnam suggested that overextension can undermine it by exposing the limits of military power, revealing inconsistencies between public claims and internal assessments, and eroding domestic trust. A foreign policy grounded in clearly defined national interests, limited objectives, and constitutional accountability offers a much more durable form of credibility than one based on demonstrating resolve through open-ended intervention. Now, in March 1965, the first American combat troops landed at Da Nang. They were Marines, officially there to protect American air bases. Within months, they were conducting offensive operations. The advisory mission had become a war. Operation Rolling Thunder began the sustained bombing of North Vietnam, a campaign that would drop more tonnage than had been used in all of World War II. The theory was that bombing would break Hanoi's will to fight, interdict supplies flowing south, and demonstrate American resolve. That theory was wrong. North Vietnam dispersed its industry, moved supplies at night, and accepted the casualties. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the network of paths through Laos and Cambodia supplying communist forces in the south, was bombed consistently but never closed. For every truck destroyed, another appeared. American troop levels escalated relentlessly. 184,000 by the end of 1965, 385,000 by the end of 1966, 485,000 by the end of 1967, and 536,000 at the peak in 1968. The average age of the American soldier in Vietnam was 19. That's 7 years younger than the World War II average. The strategy was search and destroy. Find the enemy, engage him, kill him. Success was measured by body counts. The more enemy dead, the closer to victory. General William Westmoreland believed superior firepower would produce attrition the enemy could not sustain. Kill enough Viet Cong and North Vietnamese regulars, and eventually they would run out of soldiers. Of course, the strategy misunderstood the conflict fundamentally. The enemy refused to cooperate with American plans. They avoided set-piece battles when possible, choosing time and place of engagement. They absorbed enormous casualties, losses that would have broken conventional armies, but they kept fighting. Their supply of soldiers seemed inexhaustible, because it was. American firepower was devastating. B-52 strikes turned the jungle into moonscape. Napalm burned everything it touched, and Agent Orange stripped the forest canopy, poisoning land and people for generations. Artillery fired at any suspected enemy position. The destruction was immense, but it did not produce victory. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara's Pentagon ran the war like a corporation. Systems analysis, statistical modeling, quantified metrics. The numbers said America was winning. The reality on the ground said otherwise. Light at the end of the tunnel became a recurring promise that was never delivered. Progress was always made. Victory was always approaching. The metrics always showed improvement. But the war was being lost while the reports said it was being won. Journalists in the field saw different reality than the officials described in Washington. The credibility gap entered American political vocabulary. The distance between what the government said and what was actually true. David Halberstam of the New York Times, Neil Sheehan of the United Press International, they challenged official optimism. And they were attacked as unpatriotic, defeatist, biased. They were also correct. Robert McNamara, the architect of escalation, privately concluded by 1967 that the war could not be won. Before leaving office, he commissioned a secret history. The Pentagon Papers documented 4 administrations' worth of deception. The war had been based on flawed assumptions. The public had been systematically misled. The government's own analysis showed that officials knew the war was going badly, while they told the public it was going well. Daniel Ellsberg, a Rand Corporation analyst who had worked on the study, concluded the public had a right to know. In 1971, he leaked the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times and the Washington Post. Nixon tried to suppress publication. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 for the newspapers. The papers confirmed what critics had alleged. The government had been lying for decades, documented in its own files. On January 30th, 1968, during the Tet holiday ceasefire, the Vietnamese New Year, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam. The scale was staggering. Every major city struck. 36 of 44 provincial capitals attacked. The American embassy in Saigon was breached. Fighting occurred on the grounds of the building that symbolized American presence. In Hue, the ancient imperial capital, communist forces seized the city and held it for weeks. The battle to retake Hue was among the bloodiest of the war. When it ended, mass graves were discovered. Thousands of civilians executed during the occupation. Militarily, Tet was a defeat for the attackers. The Viet Cong suffered perhaps 45,000 dead. The general uprising they hoped to spark did not occur. American and South Vietnamese forces eventually repelled every attack, but strategically and psychologically, Tet was a catastrophic American defeat. The progress that had been promised was exposed as fiction. If the enemy could mount such a massive offensive after years of American escalation, after hundreds of thousands of enemy dead reported in body counts, after all the optimistic assessments, how could victory be near? General Westmoreland had assured the public just weeks before that the enemy was weakening, that the war had entered a phase when the end begins to come into view. Tet made those assurances look like lies, or at least delusion. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted newsman in America, traveled to Vietnam. He concluded his broadcast with an unprecedented editorial. It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience in Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. If the anchor of CBS Evening News said the war was unlikely to succeed under the chosen strategy, then millions of Americans believed him. On March 31st, 1968, Lyndon Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. The war had destroyed his presidency. The war that tore Vietnam apart also tore apart America. Opposition grew from a small movement of pacifists and leftists into a mass phenomenon that convulsed American society. The movement emerged partly from the civil rights struggle. The same young people who had challenged segregation now challenged war. The tactics of nonviolent protest were applied to military policy. The first major protest, 25,000 people marching in Washington, occurred in April 1965, weeks after the first combat troops landed. By 1967, hundreds of thousands marched. The March on the Pentagon brought 100,000 protesters to Washington. Universities erupted with teach-ins and building occupations. The draft, which hung over every male student, made the war immediate and personal. Draft resistance spread. Young men burned their draft cards in public ceremonies, a federal crime. Thousands fled to Canada. Others refused induction and went to prison. Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight champion, refused on religious grounds. "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong," he said. He was stripped of his title and convicted of draft evasion. The war divided families, friendships, and institutions. Parents and children stopped speaking. The generation gap became a political chasm. My country, right or wrong, confronted, hell no, we won't go. The 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago saw police riot against demonstrators. Officers beat protesters, journalists, and bystanders while television cameras broadcast the chaos. The whole world is watching, the protest chanted. And it was. On May 4th, 1970, Ohio National Guard troops opened fire on student protesters at Kent State University. 4 students were killed. 2 of them had been walking to class, not even participating in the protest. The students had been protesting Nixon's invasion of Cambodia, an expansion of the war that he promised to end. Killing sparked a nationwide student strike that shut down hundreds of campuses. 10 days later, police in Mississippi killed 2 students at Jackson State, a historically black college. Of course, those deaths received far less attention. Not all opposition came from the left. The old right tradition that opposed intervention since World War I found Vietnam equally objectionable. Taft conservatives viewed the war as imperial overreach, precisely the kind of foreign adventure the founders had warned against. Murray Rothbard, the libertarian economist, became a fierce anti-war voice, finding common cause with the new left against militarism. The division was not simply left versus right. Conservative skepticism and military adventurism had deep roots. The war consumed resources that might have addressed domestic needs. Johnson's Great Society programs competed with military spendings. Guns devoured butter. The draft created class resentment. College deferments meant the burden fell disproportionately on those who could not afford higher education. The poor and working class fought. The privileged found ways to avoid service. Early in the war, African American casualties were disproportionately high. Martin Luther King broke with the Johnson administration over Vietnam, declaring America the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. The economic costs mounted. War spending fueled inflation. Budget deficits grew. The dollar came under pressure. Public trust in government, which had been high throughout the post-war period, began its historic collapse. The government that had lied about Vietnam would not be trusted again. The credibility gap, once opened, could not be closed. Richard Nixon won the 1968 election partly by promising to end the war. He had a secret plan for peace. The secret plan turned out to be continued war, expanded war, and eventually withdrawal on terms that could have been achieved years earlier. Vietnamization was the policy's name, training South Vietnamese forces to fight their own war while American troops gradually withdrew. It was an admission that the war could not be won by American arms, combined with the determination to delay the inevitable. Meanwhile, the war expanded. Nixon secretly bombed Cambodia from 1969 to 1970. Over 500,000 tons of explosives dropped on a neutral country without congressional authorization. When exposed, Nixon invaded Cambodia openly, triggering the protests that led to Kent State. Laos was invaded in 1971, and the operation ended in defeat. The bombing intensified even as troops withdrew. Nixon believes sufficient violence could force Hanoi to accept honorable terms. Peace negotiations dragged on for years. In December 1972, when talks started, Nixon ordered the most intensive bombing of the war. For 12 days, B-52 struck Hanoi and Haiphong. 20,000 tons of bombs. Hundreds of civilians killed, and world opinion outraged. The Paris Peace Accords were signed January 27, 1973. American forces would withdraw. Prisoners would be returned. North Vietnamese forces would remain in place. Nixon declared peace with honor. Everyone who understood the situation knew South Vietnam would eventually fall. The only question was when. Henry Kissinger privately described the goal as achieving a decent interval, enough time between American withdrawal and South Vietnamese collapse that the two would not appear connected. The interval proved indecent. In spring 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a major offensive. South Vietnamese resistance collapsed with stunning speed. The army America had spent billions training disintegrated in weeks. Congress refused further aid. The American public had no appetite for re-involvement. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. The final evacuation was chaos. Helicopters lifting off from rooftops, desperate Vietnamese who had worked with Americans seeking escape, those who had trusted American promises, left behind to face re-education camps and persecution. America had lost. The human cost defies comprehension. 58,220 American dead. Each name on the wall represents a life ended, a son who never returned, a father his children never knew. 153,303 American wounded, amputees, burn victims, men who spent decades in wheelchairs, and those numbers count only physical wounds. Post-traumatic stress disorder affected hundreds of thousands. Veterans struggled with nightmares, flashbacks, inability to reintegrate. Suicide rates exceeded general population, and drug addiction followed soldiers home. And the Vietnamese dead? Between 2 and 3 million. Entire villages destroyed, families completely wiped out. Cambodia dead? 1.5 to 2 million, including those killed by the Khmer Rouge, a regime empowered partly because American bombing destroyed the country. Agent Orange caused cancer and birth defects that persist today in American veterans, in Vietnamese children born decades after the war. An unexploded ordnance still kills Vietnamese civilians. The war continued long after the shooting stopped. What should Vietnam have taught? Not every communist movement is a Soviet proxy. Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist first. He would have accepted American support, but American hostility drove him towards China and the Soviet Union. Nationalism is a more powerful ideology. The Vietnamese were fighting for their country, not for Marxist theory. Indigenous forces fighting for their homeland cannot be defeated by outside powers. The French learned this at Dien Bien Phu. America refused to learn it for another 20 years. Lies compounded. Each deception requires additional deceptions. The credibility gap eventually becomes an abyss. And there are limits to American power. The mightiest military in history could not defeat a poor agricultural nation fighting on its own soil. A myth emerged that the military won but civilians lost. If only the press had not turned negative. If only Congress had not cut funding. If only politicians had let the military fight without restraint. This is false. The war was unlikely to succeed under the chosen strategy by the strategy employed. The press did not create the credibility gap. The government's lies created it. Congress cut funding because the public demanded an end. The stabbed in the back myth allowed lessons to be evaded. If civilian weaknesses caused defeat, then the answer was not to avoid such wars, but to fight them more ruthlessly. The Vietnam Syndrome, public reluctance to support military invention, was not a disease. It was wisdom. The hard-won understanding that some wars should not be fought. Ronald Reagan called Vietnam a noble cause. By 1991, after the Gulf War, George H.W. Bush declared, "By God, we've kicked the Vietnam Syndrome once and for all." Kicking it meant forgetting what Vietnam had taught. The same people who were wrong about Vietnam, the same think tanks, the same foreign policy establishment would make policy for Iraq and Afghanistan. And now Iran. The lessons were not learned. They were suppressed. Iraq would repeat the pattern. Initial military success, occupational failure, lies about progress, and eventual withdrawal, leaving chaos behind. Afghanistan would repeat the pattern. Initial success, occupation failure, lies about progress, eventual withdrawal, leaving the enemy in control, complete with the same visuals of people hanging on to airplanes and aircraft as they took off, leaving Afghanistan. The lessons of Vietnam were invoked to justify every subsequent war. Never the actual lessons about limits of intervention, but spurious lessons about fighting without restraint. Vietnam was not an aberration. It was a template. The war demonstrated that America could be defeated by a small, poor nation fighting on its own soil. Technological superiority, massive firepower, and economic dominance could not overcome the determination of a people fighting for their homeland. It demonstrated that lying to the public has consequences. The government that deceived the nation about Vietnam would not be trusted again. It demonstrated that wars of choice can destroy the societies that wage them. The divisions Vietnam created persist half a century later. It demonstrated that experts can be catastrophically wrong. The best and brightest led America into disaster. Why did we not learn? Why did the same institutions that failed in Vietnam continue to dominate policy for Iraq and Afghanistan and now Iran? Why does the cycle repeat? The answer lies not in intelligence or evidence, but in institutions, incentives, and ideology. The national security state has interest in continued intervention regardless of outcome. The think tanks that advocate war face no consequences when wars fail. The ideology of American exceptionalism makes learning from failure almost impossible. The founders warned against foreign entanglements. They understood that empires corrupt republics. Vietnam demonstrated what that corruption looks like. Lies told in the name of freedom. Democracies undermined in the name of democracy. A war fought not for any strategic purpose, but to avoid admitting that the purpose had never existed. 58,000 Americans dead, millions of Vietnamese died, trillions of dollars spent. And for what? Vietnam is communist today, and it matters not at all to American security. The country we devastated is now a trading partner. And the grand struggle that consumed a generation was, in the end, meaningless. The question remains, will we ever learn? The evidence from Iraq and Afghanistan suggests we will not. The pattern repeats because the institutions that produce it remain unchanged. Understanding Vietnam is essential to understanding why. The war that shattered consensus should have transformed American policy. Instead, the consensus was reconstructed, the lessons forgotten, and the cycle continued. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been episode 11 of Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars on the Consequential Actions podcast. On Sunday, Article 12 begins Part 5 with Charlie Wilson's Blowback, Afghanistan and the Creation of Al-Qaeda. We'll examine how American support for the Mujahideen created the networks, weapons, and ideology that attacked America on September 11th, 2001. If you've enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com. Here you'll find all written articles, as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause and the new Leviathan. Also, please, if you're listening on YouTube, subscribe, hit that subscribe button. It really helps. And if you're not on YouTube, hop on over at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all of our podcast episodes. And follow me on X at J. Kellick for updates discussions, and announcements. Until next time, have a great day.